We are blessed to have young men like that. I tell you what. I started telling him leave that stool, might make me look taller. Okay, we're gonna if you want to, we're going to be looking in Joshua. If you want to be turning over to Joshua 24, we'll start there. I have a number of passages in the Bible that I say are my favorite passages. I always find one that's my favorite now, but I like this passage, and I like this passage because basically Joshua is drawing a line in the sand, and that's and we're going to talk about that as we go a little farther. I've titled this lesson, I Surrender All. Beginning in verse 14, it says, Now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seems evil for you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorite, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. What we want to do today is talk about how do we surrender our will to God's. Several weeks ago, now it's been several weeks ago, one evening Nathan led the song, I Surrender All. And after that song, I remember we had a good discussion about that song and how challenging it is for us to surrender our will to God's. And I thought about that, and I asked myself why? Why is it so hard for me to surrender my will, my life, and my love to God? Why is that so hard for us to do, or for me in this particular instance? And from this, I asked myself the following questions. As I thought about this, I thought about, what does it mean to surrender my will? What does it mean to surrender my life? What does it mean for me to surrender my love to God? The second thing was, what happens when I don't surrender my will to God? And then the third thing is, how do I surrender all to God? Well, the first thing I ask is what is the meaning of surrender? So I always go to Webster's, but in Webster's, the word surrender, it says to yield the power, control, or possession of another upon compulsion or demand. Well, I thought about that definition, and I thought, well, what does it mean for me to surrender my will to God? And then I thought about Genesis. And you may ask yourself, well, what does Genesis have to do anything about surrendering our will to God? Look back in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Think about that. It says, in the beginning, God. There's nothing else. No one else. In the beginning, God. Look in verse 26. It says, then God said, let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. We are created by God. from the dust of this earth, God created us, and we are the clay. So why does the clay try to impose its will over the potter? Why? You think back to Genesis. If we don't accept Genesis, then we don't accept that there's a greater authority than ourselves. If we don't accept that in the beginning God, then how does man accept God's will? So what happens when I don't surrender my will to God? Well, the first thing that happens is sin invades our lives and our hearts. Go back to that passage above, and Joshua was telling the people that they've been given a choice. They can serve the idols that their fathers did, or they can serve God. God does give us a choice. Joshua saw firsthand the results of not serving God, not surrendering man's will to God. We know the story of Moses leading the children of Israel through the desert, and how God commanded him to go up on the mountain where he would receive the 10 Commandments. But the faith of the children of Israel was weak, and when their leader left, we see how their faith faltered. Look with me, if you will, over in Exodus chapter 32, beginning in verse 1. Exodus 32:1. Now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us gods that we should go before us, that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what's become of him." And Aaron said to them, "Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives and your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron, and he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and molded a calf. Then they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." After all they'd seen, now they said, "This is the God that brought you out of Egypt." So when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." Then they rose early the next day, offering burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go get down, for your people who you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way of which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make you a great nation.'" You know, I read that, and it just astounds me that after all that they had been through, all the years that they'd been in the desert, and now they mold this calf and they bow down and they worship this calf. They had seen the 10 plagues. They had seen what God had done, and they had seen God bring them across the Red Sea. That in itself, if I think about that, that in itself was a phenomenon that I just can't imagine. God had his people backed against a place where he knew that they couldn't escape. God did this to show his people that he was their deliverer. And so God parted the Red Sea with his own hand. God parted the sea. And they walked across that sea on dry land. Dry land, dry. Now, I don't know how deep it was. I really don't know how deep it was. But I can only imagine walking across that that path that God had laid for them, and then look up at the wall of water on either side. Here they are bowed before a golden calf saying, this is the God that brought us out. Do you think they yielded their will to God? No. The second thing that can happen when we refuse to surrender our will to God is arrogance. Arrogance overtakes us. Oftentimes we presume that our blessings that we enjoy are of our own making. It can be in man's nature to give himself credit for something that he doesn't deserve. If you look with me in Deuteronomy chapter 8, it says, when you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, in which were fiery serpents, scorpions, and thirsty land, where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you, and that he might test you to do good in the end. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. God's telling us, be careful, be careful, be careful. Surrender your will to me, because what you have, what you enjoy, the talents that you enjoy are a gift for me. They were given by me to you. And you did nothing to earn this. The third thing that happens is when we impose our will over God is so many times we want to serve God, but in many ways people want to serve God, want that service to be on their terms and not God's. Turn, if you would, with me to 2 Kings chapter 5. And I want to start in verse 1. 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and an honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and brought back a captive, a young girl from the land of Egypt. And she waited on Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Syria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. Now here's a young girl she's a captive in a foreign land, but look at her faith. She didn't lose her faith. She tells this lady that she works for, she said, if only Naaman could go to Samaria, there's a man there, he'd heal him. I picture in my mind the innocence of that young girl. And with her, there's no question, there's no doubt in her mind the power of God. None whatsoever. She's innocent. Like these children that we have, they're innocent. They haven't been tainted by the world. This young girl, her faith wasn't tainted. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. Then the king of Syria said, go Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he departed, and he took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel and said, Now be advised when this letter comes to you that I have sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you may heal him of leprosy, of his leprosy. And it happened when the king of Israel read the letter that he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends to me, heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me. Now think about this. You think about the young girl that told the lady that she worked for, her master, if only Naaman would go to Samaria, there's a man there that would heal him of this leprosy. Well, here's the king of Israel, and he's saying, what? You think I can heal somebody? Where was his faith? I mean, here's the young girl that unwavering faith. Go to Samaria, and there's a man that'll heal you. And here's the king of Samaria, and he doesn't even recognize the power of God. What am I that I can heal somebody? So it was when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. But Naaman became furious, and he went away and said, Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. Are not Abna and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and he went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more when he says, Wash and be clean? So he went down and he dipped in the Jordan 7 times, and according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And he returned to the man of God, and he and all of his aides, and came and stood before him and said, Indeed, now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now therefore, please take a gift from your servant. So, did Naaman believe? Yeah, he believed. He believed enough. He loaded up a caravan, and they all went to Samaria, and he had gold and silver and clothing. I mean, he was ready to pay. He was ready to pay up. So did he believe? Yes, he believed, because he went. Did he obey? Not at first. You see, the problem with Naaman, as much as it is with us sometimes, he wanted obedience to be on his terms and not God's. Naaman thought that when he got there was going to be pomp and ceremony, there was going to be fireworks. I mean, he thought that Elisha was going to do all this magic. Elisha didn't even come to the door. He sent a messenger and said, Tell this guy to go down there to the Jordan and dip 7 times. Naaman expected something much different. Naaman wanted his obedience to be on his terms. Well, Naaman did obey finally dipped in the Jordan 7 times, and the result of his obedience was healing. How often do we want our obedience to be to God to be on our terms. I think far too often. Far too often. I think what happens is we want heaven. Well, we want that, but we just can't turn loose of the world. Just can't turn loose of that. Can't have both. God tells us you can't have both. Go back to the passage that we started out with. And Joshua told the people, he said, choose for yourselves this day. He gave them a choice. Finally, how do I surrender all that I have? How do I surrender to God? I think James sums it up. Look in James chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Chapter 4 of James, verse 1. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not ask you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. We have to turn loose of the world. We live in this world. We do. We live in this place where God has put us, and at one point it was perfection. This world we live in was perfection until man marred it with sin. Now we live in a sin-laden world. That doesn't mean that we have to indulge in the sins of the world. We may live there, but we have our eyes on a different goal. We have our eyes on something else. Verse 5, it says, or do you think that the Scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously, but he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. Humble yourselves before God. That's what James tells us. He tells us to resist Satan. In other words, turn loose of the world. You know, some may say that doesn't God give us free will? And the answer to that is absolutely. God gives us free will. God doesn't force us to serve him, but he does give us a choice. You go back to the passage that we started with, and Joshua told the people, you have a choice this day. You can serve the gods of the Amorites. You can serve the gods that were on the other side of the river. What I like about that in my mind, I envision in my mind that Joshua draws a line in the sand and says, if you want to serve the gods that are over there, there's your choice. But as for me and my family, we're going to serve the true and living God. I know I've told this story a number of times, but it really resonated with me. And this is one of the things that I talked about at our high school senior supper over here with the young people. There's a friend of mine, and a lot of you know him. His name is Dale Rollins. And Dale's a member of the church in San Angelo. And he always uses this quote from the minister there. It says, you're free to choose your actions, but you're not free to choose the consequences of those actions. God gives us free will. It's like I told those young people, choose wisely. Choose wisely. Think about your choices. In conclusion, James says we can't be a friend of the world and still have a relationship with God. We can't do that. We either going to put God in our life or we're going to put the world in our life. We can't do both. He tells us to resist the devil and draw near to God. And when we do that, God will draw near to us. We must humble ourselves before God and remember and believe Genesis. In the beginning, God. Just stop and ponder that. Just step back and stop and think about that. In the beginning, God. We are created by God. Thus we serve God. God doesn't serve us. And by doing this, we surrender our will to God. This morning, if there is anyone among us that needs the prayers of the church, there's men that are ready and able and willing to pray for you. The power of prayers is mighty and it's powerful. I guarantee you. Evidence of that is in this room. If you haven't obeyed the gospel, if you're not a Christian, and you desire to be immersed in the waters of baptism and raised up a new Christian, we're ready and willing and able to serve you. Anything that you need, come as we stand and sing.